The lake had always been my retreat, the one place where the badge didn't sit heavy on my chest. Out there with the sun curling across the water and the loons calling from the far cove. I wasn't the sheriff, I was just a man with coffee in hand, barefoot on weathered cedar boards, breathing in pine-sweet air that seemed to come from a different century. The house wasn't much to look at compared to the modern lakefront palaces, just a 2-story cedar cabin built by my grandfather. A simple boathouse and a dock that creaked with every step. But it was mine, and more importantly, it had always been free of the noise that came with my work, or at least it had been. That illusion shattered the morning I found the first notice. It was pinned under the windshield wiper of my truck, an official-looking slip of paper with bold, black letters quoting, "I knew of her before I ever saw her." Around town, her name floated in conversations like a bad weather warning. "Careful with Karen," the bait shop owner once muttered when a customer mentioned moving lakeside. "She'll measure your lawn with a ruler and tell you it's a foot too long." She was the type who lived not for peace but for power, and she found her battleground in property lines and bylaws. At first I treated it like a mistake. My property had never been part of the HOA. My grandfather's lot sat just outside their reach, tucked along a county-owned access strip. The attorney who closed my purchase made sure I understood the significance. The HOA couldn't touch me. Their rules, dues, and fines had no teeth here. I was sovereign on this land. Still, the notice was unsettling. I placed it on the kitchen counter, poured another cup of coffee, told myself it was a simple misunderstanding. By noon, though, 2 more slips had appeared. One tucked into my screen door, another taped to the boathouse. They cited unauthorized dock construction and failure to comply with landscape maintenance. Each carried the same flourish of signature. Each assumed ownership where there was none. That evening, a white SUV crept up my gravel driveway. Out stepped the legend herself. Karen was exactly as the whispers described, pressed red blazer, heels sinking slightly into the gravel, and a clipboard clutched to her chest like it was a weapon. She surveyed my property with the squint of a general inspecting enemy territory. Her movements were calculated, pausing by the boathouse, circling the dock, scribbling furiously on her clipboard as though cataloging sins. From my window I simply watched. Years of law enforcement had taught me patience. Sometimes silence unsettled lighter than words. She paced my property line for 10 minutes, finally retreating to her SUV, her tires scattering gravel as if punctuating her anger. The lake, for all its stillness, carried voices easily. That night, from across the cove, I could hear a meeting in progress at the HOA's gazebo. Laughter, sharp and brittle, cut through the evening air. Her red blazer flashed in the dusk, a beacon of control. My name wasn't spoken, but I knew who they were talking about. It was always obvious when a group had decided on its next target. I sat on the porch until the voices faded and the moon laid a silver stripe across the water. My grandfather had chosen this land because it lay beyond such nonsense. He built here to escape rules that smother, and now, decades later, a woman with a clipboard was trying to pretend she held dominion over what was never hers. That night I locked the door not because I was afraid, but because ritual steadies a man. The badge stayed in the drawer. The house exhaled as the wood cooled. The lake sighed against the shore. Yet, even as I drifted into sleep, I knew one thing clearly. This wasn't going to end with a few notices. Karen had drawn her line in the sand, and she thought she had power. What she didn't know was that the man living in the cedar cabin, the one she had marked for removal, was the sheriff of this entire county. And sooner or later, that truth would matter. Growth had reshaped the county in ways my grandfather would have never recognized. The 2-lane highways where trucks once rolled steady with lumber and feed had become clogged with commuters fleeing the city. The old family farms, each with sagging barns and fences that marked generations, had been carved into cul-de-sacs with names like Pine Ridge Estates or Lakeview Meadows. Progress, they called it. But progress always comes with a cost. And in our county, the cost was control handed not to families or neighbors, but to boards and committees with laminated binders. The Homeowners Association on the South Shore was one of those creations of modern restlessness. It started harmless enough, or so I'd been told. A small group of property owners pooled money to clear storm debris from the lane, repair potholes, and maintain the shared dock. At first, the effort was neighborly, voluntary, and practical. But as more houses sprang up and city families bought weekend getaways, it changed. Rules multiplied like weeds in a neglected garden. Regulations appeared about mailbox colors, grass height, dock size, and even the kind of curtains visible from the road. The board grew teeth, and with it came the kind of authority that thrives on fear of disorder. Into this, Karen arrived. She was not content to be a member of the association. She became its voice, its face, its weapon. Within weeks of buying her oversized White House on the Hill, she maneuvered herself into the presidency. She carried herself not as a neighbor but as a monarch whose dominion stretched across every lot that touched the lake. Where others on the board saw guidelines, she saw laws. Where others hoped for cooperation, she demanded compliance. And where others respected boundaries, she saw opportunity to expand. The irony, of course, was that my property wasn't hers to govern. When I bought the lake house years ago, I had chosen carefully. My grandfather's parcel, with its cedar cabin and crooked dock, sat on a sliver of land the county never allowed into the HOA. The surveyor, a wiry man with a grin as dry as cedar bark, had tapped the rebar pin with his boot and said, "This here is freedom. Their rules can't touch you on this side." The deed confirmed it. The county clerk confirmed it. For years, no one contested it. My home was sovereign ground, but Karen didn't like exceptions. Exceptions undermined the illusion of control, and control was the foundation she built her little empire on. At first, I thought ignoring her would be enough. People like her often need conflict to survive. Starve them of it, and they wither. But ignoring only emboldened her. The notices grew more aggressive. What started as warnings about paint colors turned into threats of fines. She claimed the HOA could restrict access to shared lakefront facilities. Though I had my own dock, she hinted utilities could be influenced. Though the power lines were county managed, the words dripped with implication, crafted to make a man question what he knew to be true. By the second week, she escalated. Drones. The faint whir of propellers above the pines announced her surveillance. One afternoon, as I stacked firewood on the porch, a drone hovered overhead, lens angled directly at the dock. I could almost feel her behind the remote, perched smugly in her living room, gathering evidence. It left me with an old heat in my chest. The same I'd felt when suspects tried to intimidate witnesses, or when bureaucrats tried to override the law with nothing but volume. I didn't smash the drone, though every instinct wanted to. I simply stood there, arms folded, and let it leave, knowing patience is sometimes more powerful than anger. Still, patience has limits. And mine was being tested. The deeper truth beneath Karen's crusade was this. The HOA thrived because people feared losing order. Change unsettled them. The county's growth had brought strangers new traffic and uncertainty. For families who wanted the lake to stay frozen in time, the HOA was their shield. Fines and rules gave the illusion that someone was in control, that chaos could be managed with signatures and bylaws. Karen exploited that fear brilliantly. She became the face of order, the enforcer of standards, and as long as she gave her neighbors the feeling that their investment was protected, they would back her, even against someone who wasn't in her jurisdiction. I saw the impact of her grip at the sheriff's office too. Deputies would mention, offhand, that the HOA had filed safety complaints. Petty things, boats tied unsafely, bonfires too close to property lines, teenagers trespassing, when they were only cutting across a corner lot. The calls clogged the dispatch log, wasting hours that should have gone to real emergencies. Yet every time Karen phoned, she did so with the full expectation of compliance. In her mind, the HOA wasn't just a neighborhood group, it was law, and anyone who resisted was a criminal in need of punishment. For me, the struggle went deeper than property rights. It became about identity. Off-duty, I wanted to be just a man on his porch, sipping coffee by the lake. I didn't want to be sheriff here, but Karen's relentless campaign forced me to feel the weight of both roles. To ignore her was to invite escalation. To respond was to risk blurring the line between neighbor and officer. It was a balance beam, and every new notice she left at my door tipped the beam further. The hardest part was the neighbors. Some avoided me now, uncomfortable with being seen on my side. They waved quickly, then disappeared into garages, siding with silence. Others whispered apologies in grocery aisles, quietly admitting they thought the HOA had gone too far but were too afraid to speak against it. And a few, emboldened by Karen's fire, joined her chorus, leaving snide comments about outsiders who didn't respect community rules. It wasn't the insults that cut, it was the realization that fear had made cowards of people I once called friends. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the water in streaks of fire, I walked the edge of my lot with the old survey map in hand. My boot found the rebar pins one by one, solid in the soil, reminders of boundaries set decades ago. At the corner by the boathouse, I found something new, a wooden stake driven into the ground, bright pink ribbon fluttering from its tip. It wasn't mine, it wasn't county issued, it was Karen's. Silent claim staked in the soil of my sanctuary. I untied the ribbon and carried it back to the porch, laying it on the growing pile of notices. The stack looked absurd now, a tower of paper and plastic that held no real authority, yet cast a shadow all the same. I stared at it until the stars prickled through the sky, and I felt something settle inside me. This wasn't just about a woman with a clipboard anymore. This was about a line, one that couldn't be crossed without consequence. For weeks I had let her play her game, thinking it harmless. But she was pushing harder now, circling closer, rallying neighbors, twisting perception into power, and I could see where it was heading. She wouldn't stop with notices, drones, or ribbons. She wanted me gone, and people like Karen, when denied, always escalate. The lake, still and endless, mirrored the stars that night, as if to remind me of perspective. My badge sat locked in the drawer inside the house. But in truth, it was always with me. Not as a weapon, not as an excuse, but as a promise to protect, to uphold, to stand firm when fear and arrogance threatened the quiet lives of others. Karen didn't know it yet, but her fight wasn't with a man ignoring her notices. It was with the sheriff of this county, and sooner or later that reality was going to crash into her illusion. The osprey that dove into the lake that morning brought more than a fish back into the sky. It brought memory, the kind that doesn't ask permission before it settles in, heavy and unrelenting, watching the bird rise with its prize, wings dripping silver droplets into the air. I remembered my father's hands, broad, calloused, patient, as he patched the hull of an old rowboat on the very same shore decades ago. He used resin and cloth, his fingers slow but steady, teaching me that some things aren't worth rushing. A boat patched in a hurry sinks, he used to say. His voice echoed in my head as clearly as if he were standing beside me. It was here, on this lake, that I first learned what home meant. Not walls, not deeds, not fences. Home was the smell of cedar and rain, the way the dock rocked under a boy's bare feet, the call of loons after dusk. It was a place where family gathered even when life pulled us in opposite directions. My father believed in that. My grandfather before him did too. And when the cabin passed into my hands, I swore to keep that spirit alive. The land wasn't just mine, it was a piece of our lineage, a piece of who we were. But memory has edges. This lake also carried the weight of grief. My marriage hadn't survived the long lines, the constant calls, the exhaustion that comes with wearing a badge too long. My wife had grown tired of the silence in our house, the way the job clung to me like mud I couldn't wash off. She left, taking laughter with her, leaving only echoes. The cabin was supposed to be our escape, our healing ground. Instead, it became my refuge alone. Nights by the fireplace turned into nights staring at flames, replaying mistakes I couldn't undo. My son, though, he was the thread that kept me tethered. As a boy, he loved the dock. I can still see him racing along the boards with a fishing pole twice his height, shouting about the one that got away, The lake was his playground. Later, when he grew taller and leaner, when the boyish laughter gave way to the guarded silence of adolescence, he still came here. Even when words failed between us, we could sit side by side at the end of the dock, our feet dangling in the cool water, and the lake filled the silence with something gentler than words. When he left for basic training, he carried a piece of the lake with him. I saw it in his letters, short notes about how he missed the smell of pine, how the memory of the cabin steadied him when the drills pushed too far. He came home with sharper eyes, a posture that spoke of discipline, but the dock still recognized him. His stride across the boards was different, more cautious, more aware of weight, but it was still his. The house remembered him. So did I. All of this swirled in me as I stood on the porch. Karen's notices stacked high on the table. It wasn't just paper. It was intrusion into the very fabric of memory. This cabin was more than property. It was a vessel of everything that made me, everything that kept me going when the badge dragged me through darkness. Losing it wasn't just about losing a house. It would be like losing family all over again. And that's what gnawed at me most. Karen didn't know any of this. To her, the house was a box with a roof that didn't match her palate, a dock that didn't fit her measurements, a yard that didn't bow to her committee's expectations. She saw only control and compliance, not history, not meaning, not heart. She treated the place like a chess piece to be moved or removed if it didn't fit her game. The injustice of it churned in me, but deeper still was a sadness that people like her could strip the soul out of a place and reduce it to violations and fines. I had seen it before. Families torn apart over inheritance squabbles, neighbors at war over 2 feet of fence line, people poisoning their own peace just to win. And every time it left scars that lasted longer than the fight. The struggle with Karen wasn't just mine. It touched the neighbors too. I saw it in the way Mr. Sloan hesitated when he walked past my drive, his cane tapping a nervous rhythm. He was a veteran, tough as the pines, but I could see his shoulders tighten whenever the HOA's name came up. He depended on their goodwill for small favors. Snow plowing, dock repairs, and Karen's influence made him cautious. He wanted to stand with me, but fear held him back. Then there was Lynn across the cove, juggling work and 2 small kids. She sent me a quiet message one evening. "Sorry for what's happening. You don't deserve it." No signature, no details, just that. I could feel her fear of being discovered, of having her sympathy turned against her. She was caught in Karen's net like so many others, forced into silence by the fear of retaliation. That fear, more than the notices or the drones, was what cut deepest. It reminded me of the things I'd seen on the job. Abusers who ruled homes with intimidation, making families too scared to speak. Petty officials who twisted rules to squeeze the vulnerable. I had sworn an oath to protect people from exactly this kind of oppression. Yet here I was, watching it creep into my own sanctuary. And I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone. Karen had cowed into silence. I tried to hold to patience. Law teaches you that. Sometimes you wait. You gather evidence. You let arrogance expose itself. But patience is not the same as passivity. And as I stood at the end of the dock one evening, the sky burning red with sunset, I felt the line harden inside me, a line between tolerance and surrender, between restraint and cowardice. I was sheriff, not because of a badge, but because of a promise I made long ago to stand against the kind of fear Karen wielded like a weapon. And though I wanted nothing more than to be a man with coffee on a porch, the reality was that I couldn't separate who I was at the cabin from who I was in uniform. They were the same. The cabin was my heart. The badge was my duty. And Karen had forced them onto a collision course. I knew then that the battle wasn't just for property lines. It was for dignity, memory, and the right to live free of someone else's tyranny. She thought she could break me with notices and calls to 911, but she didn't understand that the lake didn't just belong to me. It lived in me, and I wasn't about to let her erase it. That night, I placed my father's old compass on the stack of notices. Its needle quivered, always pointing north, steady and unyielding. A reminder that no matter the storm, direction never changes. Karen thought she was pushing me toward compliance. What she didn't realize was that she was pushing me toward resolve. The emotional bridge had been crossed. There was no turning back. Karen had grown bold over the past weeks. The notices had escalated from accusations of unapproved roofing and unauthorized landscaping to declarations that I was in open defiance of community law. The drones came more often, sometimes two at once, humming in slow circles above my dock like vultures testing the air. And then came the letters, not taped to my door anymore but mailed with certified stamps, thick with legal jargon that suggested my property was subject to lines the HOA had no authority to impose. Still, I held my line. I filed the papers, documented the incursions, and kept my patience. But patience, I knew, is not infinite. It is a fuse, and every new act of harassment shortened mine. The first public challenge arrived on a Saturday morning. A crowd had gathered at the HOA gazebo across the cove, more than usual, their cars clogging the lane like it was a parade. From my porch I could see Karen at the center, her red blazer catching the sun like a warning flare. Her hands moved in sharp gestures, her voice rising above the murmur of neighbors. Though the words were too distant to make out, the body language was unmistakable. She was rallying them, painting me not as a neighbor but as an enemy. By midday they arrived at my property. A delegation of sorts, Karen in front, clipboard clutched like a gavel, with 5 neighbors trailing behind her, their faces tight with a mix of duty and unease. They stood at the edge of my driveway, not daring to step farther, but their presence was declaration enough. Karen raised her voice so it carried, reciting phrases about non-compliance, removal, and threats to community harmony. Each word was intended for the ears of the witnesses, not for me. It was theater, staged with my home as the backdrop. I stood on the porch, arms crossed, silent. Years in law enforcement had taught me that sometimes silence is more powerful than rebuttal. Let people reveal themselves. Let arrogance burn hot enough that others feel its heat. Karen's voice grew sharper as my silence stretched. Her supporters shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between us, as if waiting for a line to be crossed. Finally, she snapped her clipboard shut with a crack that echoed off the trees and declared they would take further action. The group retreated, though the glances they threw back told me this was far from over. That evening, I walked the perimeter again. More stakes had appeared, driven into my soil. Pink ribbons fluttered in the wind like flags planted by an invading force. At the base of one stake lay a laminated sign, "This property is in violation of community rules. Removal may be pursued." The audacity of it pulled a bitter laugh from my chest. The HOA had no authority here. They knew it, and I knew it. But they weren't trying to win legally. They were trying to win by perception. If enough neighbors believed, perception could become reality. And then came the call. The sun had barely risen the next morning when the first deputy cruiser rolled down my gravel lane, its tires crunching with the weight of inevitability. I knew the sound before I saw the car. I stepped out onto the porch, coffee still steaming in my hand, and watched as 2 deputies, young ones, both new to the force, stepped out with cautious expressions. Behind them came the white SUV, and behind that a handful of neighbors. Karen emerged, her red blazer immaculate, clipboard tucked beneath her arm like a victory flag. Her face was triumphant in the way of someone who had orchestrated a spectacle and expected to see it play out on her terms. The deputies approached, exchanging a glance that told me they were uncomfortable. One cleared his throat and began to explain. A 911 call had been placed early that morning by Karen, reporting a trespasser on this property. According to her, I was illegally occupying the house, which she claimed was subject to HOA repossession. She had presented it not as a neighborly dispute, but as a matter of public safety, requiring immediate police intervention. The audacity of it would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. 911 is not a tool for grievances. It's for emergencies, for lives at risk. By weaponizing it, Karen had crossed a line I could no longer ignore. The deputies, to their credit, hesitated. They knew me. They knew the badge I wore, the oath I had taken, the authority I carried. But procedure demanded they treat the call seriously, until it could be dismissed. Karen knew that too. She stood just behind them, voice raised for the gathered neighbors. You see? Even the sheriff can't break the rules. He will be removed today, like anyone else. The theater was in full performance now. Neighbors filmed with phones. Karen basked in the spotlight, believing the law itself was bending to her will. But here's the thing. Law isn't theater. It isn't perception. It isn't a clipboard or a stack of notices or the noise of a crowd. Law is steady, unyielding, rooted in truth. And the truth was simple. This land was mine. This house was mine. And Karen's authority ended at the edge of her own driveway. I set my coffee down on the porch rail, straightened, and walked to meet the deputies. I could see the relief in their eyes as they recognized the calm in my stride. This wasn't going to be a shouting match or a scuffle. This was going to be clarity. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting match. Neighbors shifted. Phones lowered. Karen's triumphant expression faltered, just slightly, as the deputies turned, not toward me, but toward her. One asked her to step aside so they could clarify the complaint. The color rose in her cheeks, but she obeyed, muttering about corruption and abuse of power. The crowd began to disperse, the theater unraveling before her eyes. The storm had broken, but I knew it wasn't over. People like Karen don't retreat when exposed. They regroup. They double down. They find new angles of attack. Still, as I watched the last of the cars pull away, I felt a steadiness return to me. The public challenge had come. The HOA had weaponized perception, and 911, and in the face of it, truth had held. But something deeper had shifted too. The conflict was no longer private. It was no longer about notices, drones, or ribbons. It was public, undeniable, and escalating toward a reckoning. And I was ready. For days afterward, the neighborhood buzzed. The confrontation had played out on half a dozen phone screens, replayed in living rooms, whispered about at dockside gatherings. Some watched the footage with amusement, others with unease. But all saw one undeniable fact. Karen had called 911 on the sheriff of the county, claiming he was a trespasser in his own home. The spectacle bruised her authority. Neighbors who once feared her began to question if she could twist the truth about me. How many times had she done it to others? The first crack appeared when Mr. Sloan shuffled up my drive one evening, cane tapping the gravel, his weathered face tight with shame. He had been at the gathering, silent among the crowd. Now, in a voice low with confession, he told me something I hadn't expected. Weeks before Karen's campaign against me began, she had pressured him to sign documents he didn't understand. Papers, she claimed, were necessary to update association bylaws, but the fine print, Sloan admitted, seemed to shift property lines, nudging his boundary inward, awarding slivers of his land to common use. He refused, but others might not have. He urged me to look closer. The very next morning, evidence started to surface. Lynn, the young mother across the cove, left a manila envelope tucked into my mailbox. Inside were photocopies of HOA letters. Threats nearly identical to mine, accusing her of structural violations for a shed her late husband had built years before. What chilled me most was the final page, a proposed remedy agreement, requiring her to sign away easement rights at the back of her property in exchange for forgiveness of her fines. She hadn't signed, but fear had silenced her until now. Seeing Karen's failed spectacle gave her the courage to share it. It was becoming clear. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules with zeal. She was manufacturing violations to pressure homeowners into surrendering control of their land. Bit by bit, stake by stake, she was redrawing the map of the lake. And my property, free from HOA oversight, had been her boldest target yet. I spread the documents across my kitchen table, the pile of notices beside them. Together they told a story. An empire of control built not on law but on intimidation. Karen wasn't defending community harmony. She was expanding her dominion, one manipulated neighbor at a time, and she had underestimated just how carefully a sheriff keeps records. I began my own quiet investigation. Not as sheriff, at least not officially, but as a man determined to protect his neighbors and his family's legacy. The county clerk's office provided the first confirmation. Public filings revealed multiple amendment attempts to HOA bylaws, each introduced under Karen's leadership. The language was buried in legal jargon, but the intent was unmistakable. Gradual annexation of properties at the edges of the HOA, pushing its reach farther than the original charter ever allowed. The second confirmation came from the tax assessor's office. Several homeowners had recently discovered adjustments to their property values. Adjustments that coincided with Karen's accusations of non-compliance. It was a pattern, subtle but consistent. Her notices, her threats, her demands, they weren't isolated. They were calculated steps in a larger design. The revelation hit me harder than I expected. This wasn't just about my dock, my boathouse, or even my land. It was about the entire lakeside community. Karen was leveraging fear, bureaucracy, and false authority to seize control of land that didn't belong to her. Families like Lynn's and veterans like Sloan were pawns in her game. I had thought my battle with her was personal. Now I understood it was bigger. It was systemic. As the pieces fell together, so did my resolve. The badge in my drawer wasn't just a reminder of duty, it was a tool. And for weeks I had kept it tucked away, determined not to let the sheriff and the neighbor become the same man. But the line was gone now. When a person abuses power to harm others, silence becomes complicity. It was time to act. The next step came unexpectedly. A call from the county's 911 center. This time not a false complaint, but a request for review. They had flagged Karen's earlier call as suspicious. The recording revealed she had misrepresented herself as acting on behalf of community security, a phrase suggesting official authority. Dispatchers wanted clarification. Did the HOA have any sanctioned enforcement capacity? My answer was immediate. Absolutely not. That recording became evidence. Not only had Karen abused 911, but she had impersonated a security authority to give weight to her complaint. A false report. A crime in itself. Still, I knew caution was required. Publicly moving against her too soon could fracture the community, deepen divisions, and feed into her narrative of corruption. What I needed was undeniable proof, evidence so clear that even her supporters could not twist it. And as fate would have it, that proof arrived from a source I hadn't expected. A neighbor I barely knew. A quiet man who kept to himself at the far end of the lane. Showed up one evening carrying a thumb drive, he explained, nervously, that his home security cameras had caught footage weeks earlier. Karen and 2 HOA board members sneaking onto his property at night, measuring and photographing his shed. The timestamp proved it was done without permission, under cover of darkness. He hadn't wanted to get involved. But after seeing her spectacle with 911, he realized silence was no longer an option. I loaded the footage onto my laptop and watched the red blazer move through shadows, clipboard glowing in the infrared. She had been trespassing. Not just harassing, trespassing. With intent. And she wasn't alone, she was leading others. The revelation was complete now. Karen had escalated past notices, past intimidation, past spectacle. She was committing crimes. The HOA wasn't a governing body anymore. It was her personal tool for expansion. And she had dragged her neighbors into illegal acts they might not even fully understand. For the first time since this battle began, I felt a cold calm settle over me. The kind of calm I knew well from years in law enforcement. The clarity that comes just before you move in, after you've gathered the evidence, when the case is no longer about suspicion but certainty. The unexpected revelation wasn't just that Karen was petty, or overzealous, or drunk on authority. The revelation was that she had built her entire campaign on lies, manipulation, and crime, and in doing so she had given me everything I needed to end it, not just for myself, but for everyone she had intimidated into silence. The storm that had been gathering wasn't just going to break. It was going to wash her empire away. The storm broke on a Thursday morning. It began, as storms often do, with stillness. The lake lay flat and gray, a mirror without ripples. The air held its breath, waiting. My kitchen table was covered in evidence. Karen's notices, Lynn's envelope of letters, Sloane's testimony, the county filings, and the thumb drive of midnight trespass footage. Each piece by itself was troubling. Together they were damning, a web of lies and intimidation woven into something she could no longer deny. For weeks I had restrained myself, hoping patience would be enough. But when corruption festers unchecked, patience turns into complicity. I had crossed that bridge in my heart already. It was time to cross it in the open. That morning, I called the county prosecutor. I laid out the case, not just as a homeowner defending his cabin, but as a sheriff fulfilling his oath. The prosecutor listened in silence, the kind of silence that means every word is being weighed. When I finished, he asked only one question. Do you have the documentation? I slid my hand across the pile on the table. Every last page. By afternoon, official complaints were filed. Karen's misuse of 911, her impersonation of authority, her trespassing, her attempted annexation of properties through manipulated paperwork. It was all on record, and because I knew better than anyone how appearances could twist truth, I recused myself from direct involvement. Another county agency would take the lead, ensuring the process was above reproach. The following week, the storm truly arrived. But this time, the crowd was different. Where once they nodded, now they questioned. Where once they feared, now they murmured. And when a deputy, one of my own but acting under orders from the county attorney, stepped forward with a warrant in hand, the murmurs turned to stunned silence. The red blazer stiffened, her eyes darted, searching for allies among the faces that no longer mirrored obedience. When the deputy announced the charges, filing false reports, criminal trespass, misuse of authority, Karen's voice faltered. She tried to shout them down, but the authority she had wielded like a weapon was gone. The clipboard that once seemed like law was just paper. The blazer was just fabric. The illusion had shattered. The moment was not triumphant. It was heavy. Watching her taken into custody, I didn't feel the thrill of victory. I felt the gravity of how far a person can fall when control becomes an idol. She had convinced herself she was protecting the community, but in truth she had been consuming it, piece by piece, until nothing would have been left. Afterward, the neighborhood was different. The pink ribbons disappeared from yards. The drones went silent. The notices stopped. People came to my door, not with fear in their eyes, but with relief. Sloane shook my hand with a firmness that surprised me. Lynn brought her children to play by the dock, saying they finally felt safe again. And the quiet man with the security footage nodded once as he passed me on the lane. No words needed. The cabin, too, seemed to breathe easier. The boards of the dock creaked with a lighter rhythm. The wind through the pines carried no tension. Only the steady sigh of nature returning to balance. The lake had seen storms before, fires, floods, disputes. But it always endured. It would endure this too. Yet for me, the true resolution came not in Karen's arrest or the neighbor's relief, but in the stillness afterward. Standing on the porch at dusk, coffee in hand, I felt the weight of the badge in my drawer and the history in the soil beneath my boots. The fight had reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten: why I took the oath in the first place. Law is not about power. It's not about control or authority for its own sake. It's about protection. It's about ensuring that people like Sloane and Lynn can live without fear of being bullied by those who mistake rules for dominion. It's about preserving dignity, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs you peace in your own backyard. Karen had tried to weaponize law to erase that truth. But the law, when wielded honestly, is not a weapon. It's a shield. And shields are meant to protect the vulnerable, not empower the arrogant. The moral impact lingered in my mind long after the storm passed. I thought of my father, patching that old rowboat, teaching me that a boat rushed will sink. He was right, of course, but he also taught me something deeper, something I hadn't realized until now. A boat patched with care, with patience, will carry you through any storm. The cabin was my boat. The community was too. And as long as I held steady, no storm, Not even one in a red blazer with a clipboard could sink us. Weeks later, the lake returned to its rhythm. The loons called again at dawn. Children's laughter carried across the water. The HOA, stripped of its tyrant, returned to its original purpose, fixing potholes, clearing storm debris, helping neighbors instead of hurting them. And while the scars of Karen's reign would linger, they were fading into lessons rather than open wounds. As for me, I kept walking the boundary lines, flashlight in hand, survey map folded in my pocket. Not out of fear anymore, but out of respect. Boundaries matter, not because they limit us, but because they remind us what is ours to protect. The last of the pink ribbons had been burned in the fireplace weeks before, their ashes scattered in the soil where they never belonged. In their place, I planted wildflowers. Small, quiet, unassuming, but alive, vibrant, and rooted. A reminder that control crumbles, but life, given the chance, always grows back stronger. And as the sun set over the lake one final time that season, the badge sat once more in its drawer, gleaming faintly in the fading light. I was content to let it rest there, knowing it had done its work. The lake exhaled. The house stood steady, and I knew with a certainty that ran deeper than the water itself, that home was safe again.